As I said, I think there's a bit of a different perspective where we had a lot of discussion and interesting observations about stakeholders, and I think there are obviously many issues that align, particularly the issue of access and how reflective our universities are, whether they're public or private, with the overall population defined in some way. And so that is, I think, one of the elements that also differentiates California in compared to many other parts of the world is what is the role of these institutions in a larger system of education, public or otherwise, and that's a distinguishing aspect of any discussion about California. I will note that we have organized kind of the way that we're going to talk about this very expansive subject in these kind of four categories of university mission and within a system, broadly defined, including access, what's its role in access. We have the core mission of teaching and research, public service and economic engagement, and then also related, very importantly, is governance management and accountability. So this is just a way to frame creating spheres of policy that we can discuss the California side of this discussion. And so briefly, macro, what's happening in the world. As Carolina noted, California has its story of declining public investment. These charts simply give you a sense of the change, whereas state funding was such an important core aspect of the budget for the University of California historically. At its peak, I think it was 80% of a very different kind of University of California 50 years or 60 years ago, because the research side has grown so much and other activities. But you can see this shift where tuition has become a much more significant component of the general operating budget. And it is always important when you're talking about budgets to think of operating budget and then capital budget, because those are two different sides of a very important budget equation. So, and then you can see this rising role in terms of tuition for paying on this chart on the right side for students paying for the educational costs, but at the same time, which reflects the bottom chart, rising student to faculty ratios, there's an adjustment in that data set because they're starting to include faculty that are funded outside of state funds. That's that drop you see right there. But we're seeing that basically student faculty ratios are generally rising. That's part of the budgetary scene. And we are getting, one could say, politicians might say, more efficient because we're spending less per student. But there are, I think we all understand that there are quality aspects to that kind of a shift. So this is a major component in our world and how we deal with our public role, and we'll come back to this theme a number of times. So I'm going to talk about this issue of the university's role in the larger system so that our Chilean colleagues have a stronger sense of that, and the issues of access. So it's not, we can't talk about all of these issues. This is a scoping of the range of issues that one might talk about in terms of the role of the University of California and Berkeley specifically in a larger system and its role in access, in reflecting the population of a distinct area of service. But I'll touch on some of these issues, but we can't obviously get into all of them. So one historical thing you have to understand is that the University of California is part of a coherent network and structure of higher education that really goes back to the 1920s and before, and that's with the development of the community colleges, which in fact this campus in Berkeley was very important in promoting and developing the idea of the associative arts degree, which you've probably heard of, which is also used in many other parts of the world now, including Japan, has its origins right here on this campus in the School of Education. The dean of that school promoted this idea of first 2 years at a local, basically an extension of the high school, could serve as the first 2 years at Berkeley, and then providing a transfer function that students could actually come to Berkeley if they couldn't get in at the freshman level, or perhaps they chose not to, or had different career paths or different interests. So you can see this overall tremendous growth in the community colleges, which is that top line. And you can see the relative roles in terms of serving the total population of the other two public segments, the University of California, which is that bottom blue line, and then the California, what became the California State University. And then you can also see the significant role of private institutions, but still relatively small in terms of undergraduate education. Particularly, this is all students, but huge reliance on the public system in California and generally in Western states. So here's another way of looking at it in the contemporary world, that there's this large array of different institutions. There is a growth in the for-private sector as well. This map shows the public location of institutions, which pretty much align with population centers within the state. So obviously a vast network of institutions that are linked in various ways, and specifically related to the transfer function, which I'll come back to a little bit. But here's another snapshot of the public system and where the students are and their total numbers within the state. You can see that the public segment is the largest, around 80% of the entire number of students. But the thing that many people don't understand, either in California and elsewhere, is how many of these students are in community colleges. As Saul Geiser has done work on, it's a tremendously high percentage, much higher than any other state. It's a kind of a questionable balance, but we were not going to discuss that at this moment. This is just to simply show this kind of dividing line of different institutions and where the students are. This I won't get into too much, but gives you an outline of the transfer function. So at Berkeley, for example, and throughout the UC system, around 26% of all the students at the undergraduate level walking around campus here are transfer students. That's a very robust number comparative to any other state, and certainly this model doesn't really exist in any significant way throughout the rest of the world. This is a high level of coordination between institutions. They are not islands into themselves, which is usually the norm in most national systems of higher education. This structural approach basically provides, in fact, geographic balance, greater access to either the California State University system or UC. Students can have, in other words, multiple paths in order to get into a BA degree and potentially into a higher degree. This is a very dynamic system. It does have many problems. I don't mean to over-romanticize it, but it is a very significant component, I think, for being able to justify having public funds for a highly selective research-intensive university. It doesn't sit into itself. It's not inaccessible to a wide range of people, and I'll show you some numbers to give you a sense of that. Now, just looking at the University of California, obviously Berkeley is one part, and our focus is Berkeley to a large degree, but we've kind of combined elements that will talk about the UC system as a whole. This gives you a sense of that overall growth rate. I think an interesting thing to understand, too, is that the number of graduate students in the University of California is relatively small as a percentage compared to other top-ranked selective institutions. It's an interesting part that relates a lot to public funding over time, but it's also, I think, of great concern, partly for the internal budgeting dynamics for the university, but more importantly for the labor needs of the state of California. There is an actual need. The university perhaps could provide it, but it doesn't have the resources to do it. But this also gives you a sense also of how important the medical schools are, and please keep in mind that Berkeley is very unusual, being a top-ranked university that does not have a medical school. So that changes dynamics a lot. Here's a general outline, again, I won't go through it all, of the internal structure of the University of California. And again, to note how important federal funding is. In fact, it's a much larger contributor to the overall budget of the University of California. than state funding or tuition. But the University of California, not including the national labs, is a $24 billion, actually, I think it's actually 27, I think I'm a little bit behind, operation. Tremendous amount of money, obviously, very large. That's a budget larger than many nations, some states. But this is part of this mission differential structure in which the University of California is anointed in its public mission to be both a teaching and research intensive institution, and has a strong and historical role in public service, which we'll return to. And selecting in that larger pool of students the top 12.5 roughly percent of high school graduates at the freshman level, and then with various structural guarantees to have transfer students come in. For example, there's a rule that's been was in place before but was solidified in 1960 that 60% of the students at the University of California should be upper division. In other words, they should be at the undergraduate level at the level of junior or senior, the third and fourth year of their academic program. This is to make sure there's space for the transfer students to come into the system. So it's a structural approach which is highly mission differentiated and linked with the other institutions in various forms by the transfer function and other kinds of criteria, for example, in setting curriculum, a uniform curriculum among the high schools working with the California State University. So this is just, again, a macro kind of look at the vast array of activities and sites that the university has that relate highly to their public service mission. And I know that Henry will talk a little bit more about that. I don't know if you can see the outline. They're not just the campuses, but natural reserve systems, medical centers, community outreach and business development activities. So this is just to give a sense of a wide array of the university's activities. Now, this is to say, this is an important point that is not necessarily understood, and that is that the public, at least internationally, and that is that public universities in the United States still are largely at the undergraduate level, although it's changing, focused on the population in their state, that they have a sense of their full responsibilities within that state. And that's a very different model than the top research private universities, which really see their pool at the undergraduate level as being international, U.S.-wide. Stanford, I think, still doesn't have a high percentage of international students. It might be 15%, but they're drawing students. Well, they had a historical link to California from throughout the nation. But you can see these draws. This is simply where are the students coming from within the state. And originally the concept to geographic expansion of UC was that they would have very distinct service areas. They could recruit students outside that, but they were serving a specific area of the state. And you can see that kind of holds, but you can see a UC Merced, for example, and how important it is for drawing students in the Central Valley. And that was one of the objectives to having one of the campuses of the University of California located there. This just gives you a sense of the difference between public and private AAUs and what is the profile of those students and where they come from. As I said before, if you look at the public AAUs as the Association of American Universities, about 60 of the top universities, public and private, about evenly split. And so they're all research-intensive universities. You can see this very significant difference between the publics and the privates in terms of what kind of students they draw. Here's an example, too, that relates to, I think, the issues that Carolina was bringing up, and that is, well, how reflective is our institutions as one of their public roles of the overall general population? And there are various ways you can slice that: race, ethnicity, income. In this particular case, we're looking at income. This is the number of Pell Grant students in a selection of various universities. And don't bother with the numbers going across the institutions. That's not relevant. What is relevant is the percentage of students that are Pell Grant, which is our low-income federal policy program for low-income students. It's a grant program. The percentage and then the overall number of students is the size of the bubble. And to say it simply, the University of California, reflecting the state's population to a large degree, but also, I think, very overt, direct policies to be more inclusive, has a very high percentage of low-income students relative to the other sample group. So Berkeley alone has more low-income students, or roughly the same as all the Ivy Leagues combined, as you can see this bubble here. There's other samples of big public universities, and you can see what a high percentage. Now that does reflect to some degree, again, the demographics of the state, that they're drawing these students from a very diverse state of California, and that can be different than, say, Michigan. Michigan has a different kind of draw and also different policies. This is total cost of attendance. Again, I think I'll just kind of quickly say that the notable aspect to this is, of course, that the privates charge much more than the publics, although the publics are going up and up for in-state students generally. And you can see that line on the left showing in-state resident fees, and the overall AAU, this is AAU data, shows growth in the overall cost. And then you can see housing is an extremely important part of that overall cost for students, because most students are not living at home at these institutions. They have a residential experience of some sort. And what I would say is that it's an evolving model for public universities and how to develop financial aid structures that in fact have some reflection on what is happening in the privates. Then my last couple slides, I do want to show, again, we're only providing slices of the pie to give you a sense of the public role of institutions, again, getting back to the concept of how important are our public universities for socioeconomic mobility. Well, there are different models going on. You know, I think one important thing to note, for example, in looking at a Stanford versus a Berkeley in terms of our case studies, is that Stanford is obviously an excellent institution, highly selective, but also a lot smaller. It's not the same scale as many of these public universities, which have a much greater array of programs that reflect their historical development, often related to their public purpose. To provide programs that are often, let's say, cost centers. They cost money, but don't bring in lots of research dollars or other kinds of things. That's one way of looking at it, but the scale is quite different. But the financial structure, therefore, as you can see, the percentage of Pell Grants difference between the publics and the private. But the other part is there is this, I think there's some difficulties with this social mobility index ranking that is provided. I'm forgetting who does this, but you can see that Berkeley is highly ranked, and this is looking at a variety of factors, which I do think is a little bit questionable as to how they model this, is how they related to tuition, what their ultimate salary is 5 years out. I believe it's a 5-year out study on their overall salaries. So, but you can see that at least in this particular way of looking at it, Berkeley is highly ranked in terms of socioeconomic mobility. This is only to say that to give you a sense of the changing profile. Well, why is the profile changing? Well, there are demographic changes in California, and Berkeley and the UC system are struggling to make sure that more students from underrepresented minority groups, particularly Chicano Latinos, which are highly underrepresented in the state at the undergraduate level. But the other thing you can see that's growing so drastically, well, not drastically, but significantly, is the number of international and out-of-state students. And I don't think it doesn't have the, yes, it does. That's why is that the case? Well, and you can see relative stability in the international side I think it's safe to say all of our top major research universities have always been very global or larger in their understanding of their service area at the graduate level. It's a global market for talent. The undergraduate level has different dynamics between the two different institutions. But why is this growth in the international students? I think we all know this. It relates to trying to generate more income. So here's my just final things to say in this section. Continued underfunding of Berkeley UC. We've had a recent budget deal, but I think the best way to put it is it's like treading water, and there isn't a really significant shift or change in our overall funding. Even in the midst of a much improved economy. And I think this is a tremendous amount of concern within the university about its overall quality. Again, shifting demographics, as I said, more international students is really about the money at this point, and there are now some limits on that in the latest political deal on the budget, so that's adds some difficulties for internal finances. But I think this does relate to this big question for us. One thing I failed to mention at the beginning, one of the strengths of the California system, and you see, is that it has been able to grow the state's population. And that's a constant population growth in California. So now the question is, well, in this issue of access, can the university really have the finances to continue to grow? And that's a very big question. Then finally, also, I think this anemic overall size of the graduate education and relative to the labor market needs, which are changing, which I think Henry will talk a little bit about, is also a factor, but there's no money that's going to be hard to ever change that particular trend. So with that, I think I'll keep going, and we'll go now to Carol.
Okay, I'll try to be very brief so we have time for discussion. So John asked me to talk about the core mission of teaching and research that constitutes undergraduate education, graduate education, research, and international engagement. Very briefly, undergraduate education in United States colleges and universities has a quite different model from European and British undergraduate education. Students spend about half of their units and time studying one subject in depth, their major. The rest of their program is dedicated to acquiring breadth of knowledge across many disciplinary areas. The next two bullets are how Berkeley is now defining that breadth. 4 competencies: literate, in other words, written and oral literacy; numerate, able to work fluently with quantitative data; creative and investigative, with 4 dispositions: open-minded, worldly, engaged, and disciplined. Learning outside the classroom is really important in the American model of higher education, as is, and this is an increasing tension in the United States, as I'm sure other places in the world, professional preparation. And of course, education for citizenship, which is a very important part of the public mission of the university. Berkeley has 130 academic departments, 34 interdisciplinary graduate groups, 14 colleges and schools. The most popular majors are electrical engineering and computer science, 1,274 students; economics, 937; political science, 853; business administration, 700; and psychology, 642. That's going to be important in a moment. This is just a list of the colleges and schools. We don't have to dwell on that. So what I'm going to do is just identify where I see the challenges in each area of the university's core mission. First of all, in terms of undergraduate education, is capacity. John has already mentioned the mandate by which, or the element of the Master Plan that stipulates that the University of California takes the top 12.5% of California high school graduates. The University of California is already not doing that and doesn't really have a provision to accommodate population growth. And so that calls into question the public compact for the University of California. Cost is another issue, which John also touched upon. the cost both for the student and his or her family, but also the cost of education with declining public funding for the institution for maintaining its level of excellence and maintaining its operations. Selectivity is an increasingly important issue. There was the largest number of applications for Berkeley in its history this past year, so many as to motivate the governor's kind of notorious remark, normal students can't go to Berkeley anymore. Whether the governor was right or wrong, that suggests, again, a place where the kind of public compact is eroding, a perception that selectivity works against access. Then there's the tension that I already mentioned between an idea of a liberal education versus an education for career preparation. Another challenge is the distribution of students among majors. Obviously, you hire faculty for the length of their career, but student interests change fairly quickly, and students don't necessarily distribute themselves among majors in the same proportions as faculty are distributed among departments. And then the articulation of the University of California with other elements, segments of the public higher education system is an increasing challenge. And something John already mentioned, the increasing proportion of out-of-state and international students, again, seen as a kind of erosion of the public compact between the state and the University of California. In graduate education, Berkeley offers both professional masters and doctorates. Professional masters are about a third, or doctoral students are about a third of the entering graduate students. Professional masters about 2/3, but the actual graduate student population is split almost 50-50, 54% doctoral students, 46% masters and professional students. Challenges here are completion rates, particularly in many letters and science fields of the doctorate, are fairly low. The time to degree is a huge problem. University of California, Irvine made the revolutionary announcement this week that they're going to create a 5-year PhD in English. The kind of norm is about 10 years. This is, to some people's way of thinking, outrageously wrong and long, including mine. The adaptability of degree programs, graduate degree programs, to market needs. Overproduction of PhDs in certain fields where there isn't much of a market for them, and the diversity of our graduate student population is much less than the diversity of our undergraduate population. In regard to research, there has been a wonderful partnership in the United States, much emulated in other countries, between federal support, state university, public university support, and business and industry. That compact is really being renegotiated. There is declining federal funding for research, so it's much more competitive to get federal funding. That has eaten away at the balance between basic and applied research. And there is an evolving relationship with industry, more industry funding of research, but with it concomitant issues of intellectual property and proprietary interests in that research. And then there is, I think, a growing tension with the teaching mission of the university, as faculty are more and more motivated but to chase after research dollars, which are harder to get. And then finally, I was interested that John put international engagement as one of the core missions of the university. Did it not? Sorry.
It is a policy sphere.
It's not a founding purpose of the land-grant university. And I think there is some interesting public tension about how global the mission should be of a state-supported, not federally supported, but state-supported university. Of course, there's a long and rich history of global engagement in undergraduate education, graduate education, and research at the University of California. But a question about what the place is of a global strategy in a state-supported institution, something that the chancellor of the Berkeley campus is meeting head-on with his establishment of the Berkeley Global Campus at Richmond Bay.
Go this way.
That way.
Sorry. There.
Thank you. I'm going to go over here. Do I just do that? Yes. Good. So I want to talk about public service and economic engagement. John has put together some great slides. They're going to sort of go by fast because I don't want to actually focus on the slides except as sort of illustrations and to give you some sense of the tremendous degree and breadth of public service and economic engagement that the University of California has. The truth is, it's actually hard to get slides that really do this adequately. So I'm going to have the slides, but I'm going to really talk more about it. First of all, let me just say something about the heritage of the university. You've already heard some of this. We are a land-grant university. In the land-grant legislation, there was a focus on providing service to the state in both agriculture and technical kinds of pursuits. So there has been in the DNA of the University of California a sense that there should be, must be, will be public service. And so that's a really important thing to know. Second of all, the access to the University of California, it's not actually something that goes back that far, and it'd be interesting to trace a little more about how this has become such an important theme in the University of California. I think it started out with the notion that we were just sort of free, basically. You didn't have to pay tuition, so that provided access sort of automatically. But it's really become a very important principle, I think, for administrators and for faculty on this campus, and I think mostly in the last 20 or 30 years. That's just my sense. Others may have other thoughts about that. Judd, I'd be interested in, and Carol, who have been here a lot longer, what you think about when that really became so important. But it certainly is a fundamental concern right now of administrators who believe it's incredibly important that we maintain a university with access, and that's one of the distinguishing, defining features of what we do, and I think for the faculty as well. And I honestly believe that our faculty take lower paychecks, are willing to sacrifice income they could get by going to other places because they believe so much in the mission of this university with respect to public service and access. And at least certainly they talk a lot about it, and it is certainly the case that our faculty do get paid at a lower rate than many in private universities and even in other public universities. So something is holding them here. Perhaps it's the weather, and so maybe that's part of what's going on. But I think it really is more than that. I think it's this commitment to public service and to access. And indeed, if you look at the way faculty are reviewed at this university, research is incredibly important. Increasingly, teaching is important. Service has always been, and even more so, important now. And people are asked what kind of service they've provided. And indeed, we've added a fourth requirement. It's not quite as formal as the first three, research, teaching, and service, but we now ask people to write about their contributions to diversity and to help for marginal populations and for socioeconomic equality and things like that. So that in the cases that I write up as a dean of a public policy school for my faculty, I talk about how their research has an impact in these areas. And there's other ways they can do it other than just their research. They could try to make sure that they work with undergraduates to help underrepresented minorities in the programs in which they teach and a variety of things like that. So that's quite an important thing increasingly for our faculty, and they do get points for that. Let me just go to the first slide here to sort of say something about the wide range of public service activities. I'm going to show you some slides John put together in a minute which sort of illustrates some of these things. There's also the knowledge production. You could think that the top things are public service in the definitions we heard earlier, and the knowledge production is the public goods aspect of what we do. The labor force needs is the human capital that we provide our students with, and intellectual capital. And then the economic impact even goes beyond human capital because it's the new research ideas, the entrepreneurs. And by the way, this is not just in the economic sphere. It's really important that one of the things a great university does is it also provides new ideas in the arts and the humanities, in all spheres of life, not just economic spheres. It's very hard sometimes to measure those. It's hard enough to measure the ones that have to do with new entrepreneurship and new ideas in the marketplace. It's even harder to measure the impact of the University of California with respect to, say, American culture. But it's really worth thinking for a moment, what would America be like without Berkeley? I think it'd be a different place. Berkeley's been enormously important in this society. And in fact, it's hard to think of another university that has been as important in the kinds of impacts it's had on the culture of a society. So let me just show you some of these nice slides that just sort of illustrate. This is information on UC Business and Economic Development, Community and Social Services, Cultural Resources and the Arts, Public Policy and University Extension Programs, and just sort of where they're located. And this is for the entire University of California. The important point here is to notice just how much there is and how it's all over the state. The next slide shows you UC Health Services, nutrition programs, natural reserve sites. One of the things most people don't know is we have something like 100, I think, natural reserve sites around the state that provide for research for UC academics, but often provide for other kinds of things for people to go and visit and to learn about nature and so forth. So that's a pretty extraordinary thing. And then there's public policy and university extension programs. So the university is doing an enormous number of things. This says something about our impact in terms of employment. These are great charts, and if you're a data geek, you'd love to get into them, but I'm not going to get into detail about them. It tells the different industries across the bottom that people are employed in, and which of our kinds of well, actually, I'm sorry, in this one it's up and down, yeah. The other ones are across the bottom. But this is the majors in various areas and where they end up. And it's got face validity because it turns out people in engineering do end up in engineering. That's nice to know. People who do business do end up in business, just... There's business.
I think this is 5 years out, isn't it?
Right, that's fine, yeah. Yeah, it's over years too, what happens over time. But the most important thing is just notice that people in business end up in business, and that this is where they go to begin with, and then 10 years out, what proportion of them are in that. This is engineering, and this is engineering, I think, and they were engineering majors. So it's got face validity. But what it says is that an enormous number of people in these various fields do, in fact, end up in industries that are important for the state of California. What I want to do is, instead of going through more slides like this, is just say some things about some issues I think we should be thinking about. First, and this is not quite public service, although maybe broadly speaking it is, as we change to a model with more emphasis upon student tuition, will we be more interested and attuned to the needs of students? And I think the answer is yes. The university is, if that were the only thing happening, I think we would become more and more interested in the needs of students. Unfortunately, lots of things are happening all at once. But I think there's no question but the fact that we now depend a lot more on tuition than we do state funding means that discussions occur where people say we've got to make sure that we have a program that will make students happy so that we don't have protests and that we also don't let them down and create all sorts of havoc for ourselves in terms of their dissatisfaction with the product that we're producing. Furthermore, there's the longer term notion that we've got to make sure our students are happy because eventually we want them to be donors to the university, which is something in the past we didn't have to worry so much about. So will we be more attuned to the needs of students? I think we will be, and I think that's a good thing. Public service, if you define it as providing access to students, will we continue to do that? I'm worried about this. On the one hand, we know it's important in the legislature because the legislature cares about this, and we make a big deal about it when we go to Sacramento. On the other hand, as there's declining state support, there's less and less reason to focus so much upon it. And furthermore, we have this increasing fraction of out-of-state and international students who typically pay a lot more money and pay full freight and help support the other students that we have. So that means that we have less focus on access and more focus on students who will help support everybody else. So the question is at the moment, this works. It provides us money so that we can provide access to students from the state of California. But at what point will the state share get so small that we have to raise so much money that we increase the fraction of out-of-state and international students that access goes by the wayside? And I think we're getting closer and closer to the point at which we really, really have to worry about that, and that's going to be a difficulty. And then the bottom line question is, when it comes right down to it, will this university decide in favor of access or excellence? And I think the answer for Berkeley is it'll probably decide in terms of excellence. And I'm not sure that's the wrong choice, but it's a terrible choice to have to make given how good we are at access and what that means for those students who get a chance to go here. Means that students who are excellent in terms of everything they've done in their lives get a chance to go to a great university. And that's certainly one of the reasons I'm a dean here and why I care so much about this university. So for that to go by the wayside will be a tremendous loss. But we're getting closer and closer to having to make that terrible Hobson's choice. Maybe it's a Sophie's choice, I'm not sure. Will our public service be reduced by a decreasing share of funding from the state? I'm worried about this. It seems to me that, as Carol said, increasingly faculty will be trying to raise research funds and will be focusing on that. It used to be that a lot of what they did actually was internally funded. In fact, this was a nice social welfare state for a lot of people doing research. University of California was quite rich for many, many years. It's not so rich anymore, and therefore high-quality faculty, if they want to remain at the top of their fields, have to go out and get research dollars, and that means they're not providing public service. And I think it's one of the great things we do here at the University of California. I run a public policy school, so it's especially important to me that my faculty be out there and actually trying to change the world. That's part of our mission. Our mission is not just to have great research at the public policy school. It's also to actually change the world and to be doing public service. I actually think that's what the whole university should be doing, but it's sometimes hard. Will we be more focused on the concerns of business? I think the only possible answer is you betcha. I don't think we have any choice, but it's distressing sometimes. I know more billionaires than I ever thought I would know now. I guess that's good. I actually wish they'd give more money to the University of California, but the fact is you do, as a dean now, increasingly have the responsibility to raise money, and that means you have to interact a lot with very rich people. And very rich people are very interesting people, and they're extraordinary people in a lot of ways, but they have a set of interests that may be different than the people who are the bottom quintile in the American population. And so it's conceivable that the university will increasingly have to be concerned about their interests and their needs and less about people at the bottom of the income distribution. So that's sometimes distressing. And along with this, will we become a less a center of change and criticism of society? Will it be harder to do that? Well, the genes at Berkeley for being critics are very, very strong. And it is certainly true that there's a long tradition of wanting Berkeley to be the place that's at the forefront in terms of all sorts of change. And I think that still persists. And I think even with the donors we talk to on an everyday basis, we try to emphasize that we want to be the place that's at the forefront and not just persisting in doing the same old things. But nevertheless, as we rely more and more upon federal research dollars, as we rely more and more upon donors, And as we actually have to more and more react to students and provide them with a good experience, it may become the case that we'll be less attuned to be critics of society. And I'm not so sure that'll be a good thing, because I think one of the great things the University of California and universities in general do is they provide a place in the Habermasian kind of way where people can come and critique society. And so I think it's important to preserve that, but I think it becomes increasingly difficult with all the pressures that we have upon us. So those are some of the issues I see in terms of public service. Also, I should just say in terms of economic development, one of the things we need to do is just make the case for that, because one of the most distressing things is that I do not think that most people in California have a clue about the fact that if you take away Berkeley, not just Stanford, and it's not just Stanford that created Silicon Valley, if you take away Berkeley, Silicon Valley is much diminished. There are more engineers from Berkeley in Silicon Valley than from Stanford. Now that's partly because we're just a lot bigger program, we produce a lot more engineers, but that's the truth. So Berkeley has been very important in the development of Silicon Valley. Of course, Stanford's been extraordinarily important, but we've been extraordinarily important. And there are a lot of entrepreneurs who graduated from Berkeley. Again, because we've got such a bigger scale than Stanford, it's competitive in terms of numbers with Stanford. So we've got to make that case that, in fact, we already are actually an engine of economic development in this state, and that's one of the reasons to provide us with funding, in addition to the fact that we just educate students. Thanks.
Thank you, Henry. In an effort to enable Martin to speak and to enable there to be some discussion, I'm going to go relatively fast in what I have to say here. John asked me to speak on issues of governance and accountability as they pertain to the public. So
You gotta go through those.
going
Just
Keep
through
going.
many slides so as to
I
get
skipped.
to it. I have arrived. This is a diagram that several of you have seen before, but it's an effort to portray the governance, the administrative governance of the University of California on just the academic side. The point to be made from this, points are two. One is that it's a very large system. You have an entire university and you have 10 campuses within it. That's the blue lines. The red lines show you that we have shared governance, so there's a very important role at both the university-wide level and the campus level of consultation with the faculty through their organization, the Academic Senate. There are also very important roles within the 10 campus university for what's shown in green, meetings at intervals of typically a month to 2 months, those who have like duties within the various campuses. Now, the Board of Regents is, of course, a representative of the public. That's a very important difference between private and public universities in the United States. The board for a public university represents the people, the public, does not represent the university. Much more in a private university, the Board of Trustees is the university and represents the university. So the Board of Regents are our primary mechanism for keeping public influence and governance on the University of California. We have other mechanisms as well. There are ways in which accountability is brought in various ways. If in no other way, it is through the public access to information that makes the public universities the most fertile hunting ground for reporters of the newspapers, and so there are lots of stories. There are open meeting laws. Regents meetings are an exciting event to a visitor. It's the greatest sport you can bring them to, and what they most enjoy, of course, is the public comment period, when people get up for 3 minutes at a time and in loud voice tell the university just exactly what it should do. Finally, there is open access to all of our methodology and ways of working. A prime example of that is the Academic Personnel Manual, a huge volume with all the criteria and processes for faculty evaluation and advancement, and that is online. There are forces of change, many of which have been mentioned. The largest is less public funding, and therefore great diversification of the university's revenue sources. So we now have 5 sources where the other four, aside from the state, are of the same order of magnitude as the state funding. And I think the state funding now ranks 4 among the 5 sources of revenue. We are encountering the capabilities of information technology, and many people have a recipe for sustaining universities that is heavy usage of information technology in ways that gain efficiency. Our governor, of course, has made many statements on that. The forces of globalization have been mentioned. The nature of the media, I think, deserves mention, because that is changing. It's not a matter of the morning newspaper or Huntley and Brinkley on television anymore. It is a matter of blogs, and it is a matter of news sources that are selective to what the reader wants to hear. You go to your own news source that reflects your point of view. That is influencing views of universities. And the income disparity has been mentioned. Some of the things that I believe need to be done, one is to put the decision processes where the knowledge and the needs are. That is called by some subsidiarity, and it got into the last presidential election wearing that name and got twisted around a bit. But the idea is that decisions should be made at the lowest level where there is sufficient awareness and totality of information for the decision to be made. That then leads to decentralization, and in the case of governance of public universities like this one, I think it speaks greatly towards the Board of Regents delegating some responsibilities to sub-boards which they create, which are closer to the action. Most logically, those would be at the level of individual campuses. The regents would not go away, they would still have ultimate responsibility, but they've got to put some of the governance process down lower. We also need to find better ways to incentivize desired outcomes. Many of these have been mentioned. Public benefit research is the one I came up with, but we've got to take greater looks at our budgeting processes to find out what it is that we are incentivizing through the budgeting. Accountability is a big issue in the United States these days, particularly for public institutions. The University of California has gone at this through partnerships and compacts with the governor. There are places in the U.S. where accountability measures have a direct link to funding of universities. That's true in South Carolina. And what many universities have done, including this one, is to initiate their own accountability reports to have all of this information out there for the public. John mentioned to me that he took much of the information which has been in these informational slides from the accountability report of the University of California. My caution on accountability is that once you get to a relatively few and highly specific measures, you greatly distort the system, because the university will then teach to the test. It will make sure it does what is required and twist itself in other ways. Accountability has got to remain general and, at least to a degree, qualitative in nature. And one final slide here. I think it's very important to look at the ways of having the public mission and accountability without continual heavy buffeting by political winds. And there are 3 ways that happens around here. One is that California is blessed with a constitution which gives the University of California constitutional autonomy, as also happens for the public universities in Michigan and for the University of Minnesota. That means the legislature cannot pass laws that directly affect or directly determine what the University of California does. It can pass a budget, and that can have an effect, but it cannot say that the university must do this, that, or the other thing. That is a very essential buffering mechanism which gives the regents much more autonomy and removes them to a degree from the political process, particularly since the regents have 12-year terms. I mentioned tiered governance as another way of doing this. For the University of California, I've functioned at both the university-wide level and the campus level. The university-wide administration does a lot to deal with the state government and to shelter the campuses from political winds. not always understood on the campuses, but it's very much part of the system. So the tiering of the governance and the structure is important for sheltering the campuses from political winds. And finally, academic freedom is a concept that has been valuable over the years and which also helps shelter the university from political winds. With that, I think there's one more slide, and it is John's.
Yeah, well, I think we'll just leave that up. Actually, this was kind of the broader questions, and Henry noted, or actually discussed in various ways, many of them, and I think we should go to Martin and give Martin the time so he can make comments, and we might just bleed a little bit past our 5:30 end time. I presume the reception is ready to go when we want. Okay,
Whenever
so
you're ready.
okay, great.